If you want to turn to Judges chapter 4, that would come in handy for our first little bit here. We're going to be looking at a woman whose name I really don't know how to pronounce. I'm just going to call her Jael. Hope you're okay with that. I'm sure that's wrong, but that's what I'm going to say. Which means, by the way, lovely name for a woman, I think, mountain goat. Her parents, I don't know what her parents were thinking, but it says or gazelle, but that sounds better, but most of the things I looked at said it means mountain goat. What? Mm-hmm. So, yeah, they can't both mean gazelle, I guess. Most of the things that I saw said mountain goat. So, name your daughter Mountain Goat. Yeah. It could be used as a compliment, I guess. Thank you for seeing the bright side, the silver lining, yeah. They are handy in certain circumstances. So, who she is, besides a woman named Mountain Goat, is the woman who killed a man while he slept. We've already looked, it's been a long time, but we've already talked about Barak and Deborah, which is the context of Jael's place in the narrative of the Old Testament. She comes out to be, I don't want to say the heroine, because her methods were a little bit questionable. But just to set this up, as always was happening during the Judges period, was the people would turn away from God, and then God would raise up an oppressor. Well, the oppressor at this time is just generally called the Canaanites. And Jabin and the Canaanites were oppressing them. They cried out to God for help, and He raised up Deborah, who also, sort of as a tag team, summoned Barak. So they were going to be the ones to deliver the children of Israel from this oppressor. Well, obviously, before we get there, a very interesting statement that we don't want to take too far, but in Judges chapter 4, verse 9, when Barak in verse 8 said, "If you'll go, I'll go," if you remember when we talked about that, she responded and said, "I will go with you, but this is not going to lead to your glory. You're not going to get any. If you see a pathway to your own glory, you're going to be out of luck, because," she says, "Jehovah will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." Keep that in mind. File that away. Now, the battle goes on, or begins, I guess. And verse 15 says, Jehovah routed Sisera and all his chariots. Sisera was the general of Jabin's army, the army of the Canaanites. He routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army before Barak by the edge of the sword. Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot. So Sisera the general takes off. They're defeated. He jumps off of out of his chariot, starts taking off on foot. It says Barak pursued the chariots, and the whole they chased, and was left except for Sisera, who is running away on foot. And it says in verse 17 that he fled away on foot to the tent of Jael. The only thing about whom we know is that she was the wife of a Kenite named Heber. Only thing we know. But we also learn that there was peace between Jabin and the house of Heber, the Kenite. So, whatever tribe of people she belonged to, they had made a truce. At least her husband had made a truce. Some kind of pact with these people, it seems. So it says she came out to meet him and invited her into the tent for hospitality. And we've talked about in the past how in their culture in general, hospitality was a very high, it was, you don't turn people away and you don't show a lack of hospitality. Well, especially since they had this pact between Jabin and her husband, she said, "Turn aside, my Lord, turn aside to me, do not be afraid." She covered him with a rug. He said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I'm thirsty." So she opened a skin of milk and gave it to him. And I assume that is a good thing, that I'm not just going to give you water, I'll even give you some milk, okay? And he said, "Stand at the opening of the tent, and if anybody comes around and says, 'Is anybody here?' say no." Pretty straightforward so far. Until this turn, very graphic. But Jael, the wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand. Then she went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground while he was lying fast asleep from weariness. So he died. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, just like last week. I'm not a mind reader, but I am a fruit inspector.
Okay.
When he went there, she knew he was going to her tent to hide.
Mm-hmm.
He was being a coward. And like Debbie said, she went in softly. So she was stealth enough to know. And when she covered him with a rug, that was because he was hiding. And he knew it. And he told her, then don't let anybody in here. So she knew he was in danger. And she said, I can take care of myself. And she did.
Yeah.
So, he should have known.
Well, they were sort of on the same team. Her husband, it says in verse 17, there was peace between Jabin, the king of Hazor, and the house of Heber, the Kenite. So, whether he just stumbled, she took it upon herself to see him coming and reeled him in, or whether he went there intentionally because of this friendship or peace is not really stated. But she showed him the hospitality. I think covering him with a rug is the same thing as giving him the milk to drink. She was providing everything and more as a host, like a good hostess, and led him to believe that she was going to watch his back. So he can just go to sleep. He's been running. We don't know how far he had to run, but it says he fled away on foot twice. I got a feeling he was probably running for a pretty good while. I would be if I was him. So he's weary. He goes to sleep, thinking that she's going to watch the door and lie to anybody who comes by. But instead, she snuck in there and drove a tent peg into his head.
Was his head covered? I always, in my head, when I read this, it was like he was hiding under a rug. And she didn't really see him. And that's why she had to drive it all the way through, because she had to make sure he was dead. And
she couldn't see him?
Yeah, if he was covered, he was covered. I don't think she was just making snow.
She would just accidentally be driving a tent peg through the road.
Well,
Make it easier to kill him?
Be harder to find where you need to drive it.
Yeah, because that would add a whole layer of thick stuff that you have to put the
yeah.
tent peg.
I'm trying to see here
It's already going to be hard enough to get it through.
what the word translated rug means. That's what I thought. A cloak, a rug, a blanket, covering.
But he wasn't hiding. She knew he was comfortable.
I don't think he was hiding under the blanket. I think he was hiding in the tent. It doesn't seem that this was probably a little 4-person camping tent. I don't know exactly. But the point is, this is what she did. She said she was going to do this, pretended, but this is the course of action she chose to take. Now, I want to be very clear and very careful at the same time. Just because Deborah prophesied that God was going to sell him into the hand of a woman does not mean that he wanted her to drive a tent peg into his temple. There were probably multiple different options she could have had to turn him over to she could have turned him in. She could have done something. She could have not even, told him to come into her tent, I guess would have been an option. But I think we might, this is why I said I hesitate to call her a heroine, because I don't think she is. I don't think she did something good or worthy of praise or something that God wanted her to do. It was pretty. She took matters into her own hands, really. But she is sort of, I guess, the verse here. She is praised by Deborah in the next chapter, in the song of Deborah and Barak. But from Deborah's perspective and Barak's perspective, she should be praised because she killed the general. But I would hesitate before I say that what she did was good. Because he was the enemy general doesn't mean that the things that she did was good or the right thing to do. But anyway, I know that might be sort of murky waters, because it's not that much different than we talked about Jacob cheating his dad to get the blessing from his brother. Yeah, God told Rebekah that this was going to be the way it was, but that doesn't mean that God approved of the way they made it happen. So it was pretty ruthless. And by the way, if you looked at the handout, it points out that the women were usually in charge of the things relating to the tent. So if somebody might think, how in the world could a woman, drive how could this be? This doesn't sound like something a woman would do or would be able to do, maybe. It sounds like it would take a lot of strength. Well, apparently those women were somewhat handy in that area and knew what they were doing. Yeah, they were the ones. Apparently, that was the woman's job. She was used to hammering the pegs into the earth. I highly doubt she was used to hammering them into human skull or temple flesh. But she did. And that's about all that can be said about the things that happened. But it says, I guess a little bit more, is that Barak was pursuing Sisera, and she went out to meet him and said, "Come here and I'll show you the man whom you're seeking." Well, guess what? She could have done that without killing him. Come on, I'll show you the man you're seeking. But she chose to murder him. And it was, I don't think there's any way to call it anything but that. Not that she was a horrible woman all the time, but probably not the wisest course of action. I'm only going to draw one lesson from her, and this is probably, I've already pretty much made the point. The ends do not justify the means. You ever heard people say that without the not? The ends justify the means. Yeah, you know what that means? It means you can do anything. Anything's allowed if the end is good, is a happy ending or whatever, which, by the way, is subjective.
That's what people would use for abortion. Like, for them, the end result might be a happy, you get to murder a baby to get the baby.
Yeah, the having the baby would cause so much stress and hardship that not having the baby would be better even for the baby, right? So the ends justify me killing the baby. Really? No, the ends, and you know, that might be an extreme example, but I think a lot of people in the world use this kind of logic. And the problem, among many problems, is the greater good. Who gets to decide what the greater good is? Well, usually when you're talking about the ends justify the means, it's some person who's come up with, this is the thing that ought to happen. So whatever we have to do, whatever needs to be done to make this happen is justified. Right? That's not a biblical principle. Was it good that Israel overcame the Canaanites? Yes. But that doesn't mean that the means that Jael took to finish off the general was justified. In other words, yes?
That phrase is in direct opposition to what Samuel told Saul. Don't you know, to obey is better than sacrifice. And when we look at the walk of the Christian, it's step by step he leads us. Not, oh, I can see how this is going to end, let me get there first and finish it for him.
Yeah.
We're not playing opposition.
Yep. She had other options, but that's the one. I mean, Judges is a dark book. I mean, it was a dark time. Even in the brighter moments like that, when Israel was overcoming, you know, they were on the coming up, and it's still very dark, very graphic in parts. And that is one of the more, I mean, it's not nearly as graphic as the crucifixion, but it is fairly graphic picture painted there. All right. Unless you want to talk about her some more, or Shakespeare saying that women can smile and be a villain, which is in there if you want to find it in there. I didn't say it. Shakespeare said it, and the author of this book wrote it down, so I thought it was kind of amusing. James number 1 is John's brother, is who I'm calling James number 1. He is a fisherman, was a fisherman, who was the son of a fisherman, who was the brother of a fisherman, who was the friend of a fisherman and business partner of a fisherman, who, along with his younger brother, I put a question mark because that's just a presumption, but I think it's pretty supported, became one of the 12 chosen apostles of Jesus, but who ultimately would be the first one to be martyred. So that's what I've named James number 1. He was the man who was the first apostle to be martyred. He wasn't the first Christian to be martyred. Stephen beat him to that, it seems, and unless there was somebody else that we weren't told about. I wouldn't consider Ananias and Sapphira martyrs, so we have a record of them dying, being struck dead by God himself, but I wouldn't call that a martyrdom per se. Huh? Well, Jesus wasn't a Christian, I guess, per se. Is it possible for Christ to be yeah, I don't know. That's a tough one. I would say he was a Jew. He lived as a Jew, died as a Jew, but yeah, he's the leader, you know, the Lord, the master, so in that sense, I guess we could call him the first martyr, but at least James, John's brother, was the first apostle, undisputed, the first apostle to be martyred, And the thing is, other than the fact that he was a fisherman and that he was John's brother and that Herod killed him with the sword, we don't know much about him. What's that? He was one of the sons of thunder. Zebedee, I don't think Zebedee means thunder. So when Jesus called them sons of thunder, he was referring to their demeanor and disposition, their fiery, passionate, flaring personality, I guess. Maybe quick, short fuse, quick temper type thing. Maybe temper's not the right word, but they were very quickly passionate about doing rash things, like burning down a village because they wouldn't let Jesus stay there, which is the thing that they did. Uh-huh.
But isn't it interesting that James was the first and John was the last? And like Gabby was just mentioning when Peter was talking, he goes, okay, you're going to die just like me. And Peter's like, well, what about him?
Mm-hmm.
Peter was not the first. It was James. I just find it interesting that because it would have affected John.
Yeah. For sure. It would have affected all of them. But I guess especially John. Basically anything, well maybe not anything, most of the things that we might attribute to any of the other apostles, we can probably attribute to James also. Like he certainly left his profession like John. I mean, anything that John did for sure, we could say, give credit to James for that too. Leaving the boats and the nets and their father and the business to follow Jesus. But there were a couple of blemishes, a couple of blips, one of which we just mentioned with how they said, Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven and consume this whole village or whatever? And he's like, no, I don't want you to do that. We'll just go to the next village. We'll just keep moving. But then another thing was when he and John and their mother, brought Mama along, asked Jesus for special favors. Now, one of the accounts, I might get this mixed up. One of the accounts says that their mother went to Jesus and said this. The other two say they went, or that might be the other way around. But put them, which one's right? Both are right. They all went, obviously. Maybe their mom spoke to Jesus. Maybe she said it, like with her two boys there with her, and on their behalf she said, "Lord, give," That makes perfect sense to me. How she could be said to have done it, and they could be said to have done it as well. But it was not a bright moment in their character because that wasn't right. First of all, Jesus says you don't know what you're asking, and I can't really give you that. But the other guys didn't like it too much, and we already read about how there were some bickerings that took place about who would be the greatest. Well, imagine 2 out of the 12 going to Jesus privately and saying, "Hey, can we have the seat on your right hand and your left?" That's not going to go well with the others. Rightly so. Yep.
If we were walking with them at that time and the apostles were alive, when you develop this mindset that the kingdom was going to be set up here on earth and that what you expect will happen down here. And it's like the people in 1 Thessalonians. It's like, well, just sit here because the Lord's going to come at any time. And we have to be prepared for him to come at any time. But it's like, hey, Lord, you just took my
They're
breath.
calling shotgun on the.
Yeah, it's kind of like we expect something to happen, and we always forget to just trust. God knows the end. We don't. We sing farther along. But, it's like, hey, he was a good
Yep.
And yet, John patiently waited.
John may have wished that he may have envied his brother by the end,
Exactly.
in a way. Yeah, James and John broke shotgun rules. They did not abide by shotgun rules. You know what shotgun is? When you call front seat in the car when if you're with your friends or whatever. You have to both be in sight of the car, then you get to call shotgun, and you have to obey it. But James and John snuck over to Jesus and called shotgun, which is against the rules. You can't do that. Tabby's the one that said that, by the way. If you didn't hear, she's the one that said they called shotgun. So she planted that in my head. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, the name James is actually, look, shocker, isn't it? I didn't mess up this time. That's supposed to be there. It's the same name somehow as Jacob. Same name. What? How is James and Jacob the same name? Well, it is. I don't know. Same way Jesus and Joshua are the same name. Found that interesting. Never knew that before. Or if I did, I forgot. Because I looked at the meaning, I'm like, wait, James means supplanter? We just got done talking about Jacob. Jacob means supplanter. And then I saw, in the Greek or whatever, it's actually Jacob or Jacobos, or another form of the name Jacob. So, interesting.
Just the Greek name for the Hebrew name?
I'm not sure.
Jesus is for Yeshua?
Yeah, I am not positive. Well, I've explained how complicated the name Jesus is and how we came to the name Jesus. What is it? It's the English version of the Latin version of the Greek version of Jesus' Hebrew name. Technically, because Iesus is the Greek. And then in English, we, with our syllables and consonants, Jesus, pronouncing the J like a soft G. But as far as James goes, I'm not positive if that's of Greek origin or not. I'd have to look that up deeper than I am able to right here. Stop asking good questions. Okay, so James, he kind of reminds me of Andrew in a way because they both bore the burden of seemingly being in the shadow of their brothers. Because every time James is mentioned, he's always coupled with his brother John. Except for Acts 12:2. But especially in the list of the apostles, he's right there with John, James and John. But we also have to remember, he was in the inner circle. That inner circle. 3 different occasions, Jesus chose only 3 of them to go with him somewhere. The healing of Jairus' daughter, the Garden of Gethsemane, and the Transfiguration. Transfiguration and the Garden of Gethsemane in order. James was one of those 3. So Peter, James, and John. So that puts him in pretty elite company, he did that for some reason. Jesus did that.
The 3 fiery ones?
The 3 that needed him the most, maybe. Well, besides Judas, but yeah.
Since James is mentioned first in the New Testament, and then he goes, and his brother John, does that indicate that James is the older brother?
It could. It could be a subtle indicator of that. I guess it could mean some other things too, but to me it just seems that I think the traditionally John was the youngest, and I don't know if somebody just made that up because he was the last to die. So he must have been the youngest because he died last. Well, that's not necessarily true. I mean he could have died last and not been the youngest, but it does make sense, especially how long he outlived some of them at least.
When it's listed, it always says James, the son of
Yeah.
Zebedee, and his brother.
Yep.
In other words, he's listed as the son.
Yeah, and let me take something back. I just noticed I misspoke. He is paired with John in Acts 12:2. So he's still, even when his death is recorded, he's called James, the brother of John. So I take that back. So almost every time, if not every time, James is mentioned, this James, he's just like Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, you know. So,
But for this James, it could have just been for the sake of knowing which James they were talking about.
yeah, that's fair.
Two James that were apostles.
Yep. Which, yeah, James number 2, we probably won't talk about because there's literally, I would get up here and say, James was the son of Alphaeus and he was an apostle. Moving on, because there's literally hardly anything said about that James. But we will talk about, well, we're going to call him James number 2. There is another James that we'll talk about, Lord willing, who is actually the author of the book of James. This James was not the author, obviously, because he died very early on. But it's fascinating that we're not even given the account of how he died, the circumstances leading up to it. It just suddenly, it's talking about the church in Antioch in Acts chapter 11, and how Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul, and he brought him to Antioch, and they were there for a whole year. And this is where the disciples were first called Christians, and the prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and sort of setting up this fact that Antioch, Syria was like a headquarters for the apostles, for Paul and Barnabas. And then all of a sudden in chapter 12, it says, about that time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James the brother of John with the sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he went to arrest Peter also. That's it. Just like a little detail, oh, by the way, he killed James. And then he wanted to arrest Peter. And it's like, wait, what? Back up. Did you just say he killed James? We don't get anything. The account of Stephen's martyrdom is, Acts 7 is a very long chapter, mostly because it records his whole speech, or pretty much his whole speech. But we get everything leading up to his death. With James, it's just like there wasn't anything else to say. He killed him with the sword. And I always find references like this interesting because in a way that's kind of how life is when you think about it in the big picture. How many years have gone by since James was killed, and how many years he lived and then he's killed, and that's it. That's the end. And the world goes on, The vanity of life, kind of the brevity of life, that's what's trying to be communicated, but it reminds me of that, how he killed James' brother John, and then James' life is over. And here, the world goes on. Yep.
Is there a book that tells us historically how the apostles died?
Yeah, but it's take it or leave it kind of thing, because there's no inspired record of that.
Who wrote those records?
Well, we might know who wrote them, but we know that they're not inspired. So it's impossible for us to know if it's true or if it's just probably a Catholic tradition. Yeah. Yeah. And that's about John too, that traditionally he was kind of like Paul. They tried to kill him, but he didn't die. There's one tradition that he was thrown into a vat of boiling hot oil as a means of execution, but it didn't kill him. I can't even imagine it if that really happened. And I guess that's a historical thing that they may have done to Peter. Yeah, Peter with the upside down, crucify him. He didn't want to be crucified the way that Jesus was out of respect, so he wanted to be turned upside down. That, to me, that seems the most far-fetched personally, but these traditions came from somewhere, and we don't really have a way to know how far back they go, and they might be true. I guess technically there's a 50% chance that John really was thrown into a vat of boiling hot oil and survived, or chance that somebody just totally made that up at some point. We just don't really know. James, however, is the only apostle that we have a record of him being killed, other than Judas, of course. But the other, starting with the book of Acts, when Matthias takes his place, it seems, we don't even know if they were killed, if they outlived the epistles. We generally believe that John and Revelation were written near the end of the first century. It doesn't seem that they would have lived that long, but we don't know if they were still alive when Paul was writing some of his later letters. We don't know when they died because there's just no record of it. But James was the first, and that makes it a big deal one of the apostles has officially been killed for preaching the gospel. And the Jews were happy about it, of course. So Herod was he's like, hey, I'll just go get some of the other ones. I'll just go on a little run here. I like being popular. So that's James. He served Christ to the very end. He certainly didn't get killed by Herod because he wasn't preaching the gospel. And the Jews wouldn't have been pleased if he wasn't preaching the gospel. Why would they be happy about him being killed if he wasn't spreading Christ and the message of him and the gospel? Obviously he was. And that's what Jesus called him to do. That's why he chose him. So he was a fisherman, but he became a fisher of men. He didn't serve as long as the others, but he did serve until his very last breath. And what more can you do? That's literally the most a person can do. Be faithful unto death. All right. Lessons. We're getting this one a lot, okay? And it's a good one. People can change. He went, and this is more true of John, maybe that's not fair, but we get more from John. So the contrast between Gospels John and letters John is fascinating, because he goes from, Lord, do you want us to burn down this village, to the one that talks about love all the time. Love this and love that, and God so loved the world, and love, God showed us his love and that he gave his son, and love one another. And it's a totally seems like two different men. And I don't doubt that James, as much time as he had also been transformed. He just didn't have as much time to transform as his little brother did. But I don't have any doubt that he did change from that. And I bet he was humbled whenever he got Mama to go and ask Jesus for those special favors, and then he shut them down. That's got to be humiliating, and surely would have humbled him, the both of them. Yeah, Joe?
One of the changes that John went through was probably the last lesson he learned from Jesus. And he goes, she is now your mother.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think that's the way, when you read 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, all of those, loving the church and considering those in the church as the family of God, that you are to care for them, is a lot. Church is kind of a hard time with 1 John for a long time. I sit there and, oh God, you don't know these people. I was quite a bit younger, because he tells us to love one another, and yet that is what he was teaching John at the cross, which I find extremely interesting.
Yeah.
How we treat one another. God.
Yeah, we'll probably dive more into that next week when we look at the other James. But the fact that Jesus committed his mother to John when he had brothers is intriguing, to say the least. He still had brothers that were alive. So what in the world is he's giving? And it's, we're not just interpreting that statement to mean that, because John explicitly says from that moment, from that day, he took her into his home. So the man to whom Jesus said that wrote, from that day, he took her into his home. So he had brothers still living, but he committed her to this man. It's very interesting. Yes, sir.
Jesus, but Scripture said he knows everything about her, so he knows that what was in the mind of those men,
Yep.
apostles, and he knew John would be the best, the suitable person to take care of his mother. That's what it worked out.
Yep, seems so. I guess because he's the one that he chose. So yeah, I mean, he must have thought that. Yeah. And we've talked about with Peter before also that Jesus, like you said, Jesus knows us. He sees the best. He doesn't overlook the worst necessarily, but he knows the best too. And even negative traits. Jesus was such a master teacher that if he could just tweak it, I just need to tweak him a little bit, and this weakness of his can be turned into a strength. I'm sure that was the same thing with James and John. Just like with Peter. One of Peter's biggest weaknesses turned out to be one of his biggest strengths. James and John, you just take that passion, that fiery passion, and instead of wanting to burn the village down, you want to bring the village up. What's that?
That's what Paul did.
That's what Paul, yeah.
Down, and he's like, no, I got another guy.
Yeah. Yep. Number 2, we can outlive the memory of our mistakes if we actually counter them moving forward. So we, just speaking of Paul, I don't get caught up in what's behind. I'm pressing on to what's ahead. And I can't help but think that part of what he meant by what's behind is his shameful past, his horrible thing he got caught up in, killing Christians or persecuting Christians. But mistakes, we can outlive them, but only if we're actually moving forward and countering those mistakes, not making those mistakes again, making it right, and so on. Number 3, there is honor in the shadows, namely the shadow of John for James. Always called the brother James, which I'm sure maybe it's because there were 2 Jameses, but John certainly gets more attention today. I'm sure James doesn't care at all at this point, but John is certainly the more emphasized, just like Peter is generally given precedence over Andrew. Number 4, it's foolish to compare ourselves to other disciples. Paul said that. It would have been foolish for James to compare himself to his brother, been foolish for him to compare himself to Peter or any other of the apostles. And I assume that he probably didn't do that, or at least learned the foolishness of doing that. And finally, a great reward awaits those who give their lives to the Lord or for the Lord. Just like Paul told Timothy, I've fought the good fight, I've kept the faith. Now guess what? There is a crown awaiting me, crown of righteousness. Mm-hmm. It's the early church fathers. We don't put a whole lot of stock in them because it's not inspired, and a lot of the stuff that the early did was directly deviating from the apostles' instruction. So that's a big red flag. But that's not to say that everything they wrote was a lie, you know. So, I mean, they could be valuable if you have the time and energy to read them. I mean, the Ante-Nicene Fathers and all these things, they're big volumes, so much written stuff. And there could be some valuable things in there. I don't know how we could actually exactly fish it out, you know, in the midst of how much is written. But, you know, any old writing is going to have value in some way. And I suppose that, you know, some of the stuff could be. But the problem is, we don't know. So it's hard to you know, be affected by something that may be true, but also may be a lie, you know. So as long as we don't treat the early church fathers as apostles, like some do, or as those who we assume were led by the Holy Spirit, which again, they couldn't have been led by the Holy Spirit if they're doing things that are contrary to what we know the Holy Spirit has said. Sadly, some people can't understand that. But just like Paul said, henceforth there's laid up for me a crown of righteousness. Why? What does he mean henceforth? Because he had been giving his life for the Lord. Same is true for us.
Is one of the wonderful things about the Lord's table. He blots out our sins and mistakes. Righteousness in Revelation, it says, our deeds, whatever we do for God or the church here, will follow us to heaven. The deeds go with us. So that crown of righteousness is actually means
Yeah, it's a scary thought, though, at the same time. Your deeds will follow you. That could be a scary thought. And it should be if we haven't made them right. I'm sure I'm not the only one here who doesn't want all of my deeds to follow me. I'd like some of them to follow me. I don't want all of them to follow me. But there it says, their deeds, you know, your deeds or their deeds follow them. But like Joe said, the reason that doesn't have to be a terrifying thing is because whenever we obey the gospel and walk in the light, the bad deeds are blotted out. So, but either way, the deeds follow us. If we haven't made them right, then they will answer for them. They will follow us there. Can't run from them. And even on earth, many criminals have learned that the hard way, and murderers maybe, and other types of crime and sin. They find out that they can't run from it. It will come back to haunt them eventually. And eternally, that can be the case too. But if we give our life to the Lord, obey the gospel, and dedicate our lives to His cause, blot it out. No condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, Romans 8:1.